everybody, welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are going to talk about forest management. Now, this is very timely in the fact that the country is experiencing another catastrophic wildfire, and many are claiming that the purpose or the cause of that is poor management of forests. We saw it earlier this year with the Dixie Fire in southern Utah that started at Bryan Head and moved its way over to Panguitch. So we are going to talk about the role that good forest management plays in keeping fires in check. Joining us for our conversation today, Kane County Commissioner Jim Mattson, who has a prior life in the forestry business. And joining us from Portland, Oregon is Tom Parton, who is a forestry consultant in that neck of the woods. Thank you for making the trip down here to join us for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
Good. I'd like to know a little bit about your background and why you can speak with authority about forestry. Jim, we'll start with you.
Well, I started out with my interest in this with my education in the early 60s, and so in 1965 I attained a degree in forestry. And I promptly went to work in the forest products industry in southern Utah and northern Arizona. And I did that for 30 years, and the 30 grand years doing that as we went through our processes there. That was back when the Forest Service was actually in the business of managing its lands.
Okay. Tom, how about you?
I graduated from Oregon State in 1975. I worked 7 years with the Forest Service, actually working on their marking crews, timber crews, and got a little bit of a sense of the management techniques they were using. I went to work for a small company called Ochiko Lumber Company in Prineville, Oregon, and in 1983 we built a second mill in John Day, Oregon, and I went over there and managed that mill. And over the course of about 20 years, and the Forest Service started cutting back on their harvests, our mills shut down, at least 2 of the 3 did. And then I had to take another job as a Forestry Association executive in Portland. I oversaw the American Forest Resource Council from 2001 to 2015.
Wow, that's
so I have a base of a little bit of management, sawmilling, and policy work.
That leads us to a good question. Forests used to be managed primarily by commercial activity to thin forests. Some people will have in the back of their mind clear cutting, but that really stopped about the time the Forest Service was established, if I'm not mistaken. Can forests be financially self-sustaining without destroying the resource? That's my first question.
I think so, without a doubt. If we remove all of the bureaucracy and still keep our hearts and minds focused on what the landscapes and those watersheds are in need of, if we get hung up on bureaucratic kind of processes, next thing you know, we've lost the whole battle. So I think we need to get back to the basics on the ground as they can function in such a fashion that these processes, these projects will actually pay their way and provide a tremendous benefit with little or no risk to the publics.
You had a company with 3 sawmills.
3 sawmills.
And you had to close 2 of them.
2 of them.
In some of the most timber-rich area in the country.
The county was probably 70% owned by the Forest Service, and yes, their harvest went from 130 million down to roughly 15 to 20 million. And so that's why we had to close our mill, at least in the Prineville, Oregon area. The Malheur National Forest over in John Day, Oregon, at one time was cutting over 300 million board feet, and it went down to somewhere around 40 million.
So an average guy listening to that saying you're cutting 3 million board feet will think
300 million.
300 million. They'll go, well, that just clear cut the forest. Yeah. There couldn't possibly be a tree left.
Well, I think we have to understand that the forests grow a lot of fiber, and the forest is growing that amount of fiber each year, and what we have is a sustainable harvest level. And I think the problem we got into in the 80s and early 90s is the management techniques were focusing on just removal of the larger trees and not doing the full gambit of work we needed to do on thinnings and maintaining and restoring our forests. So when the environmental community said we're overcutting our forests, it seemed like everything just came to a stop, and the pendulum swung way to the other side of the management, which was basically no management.
You bring up a good point. You know, one would think you want to cut the big trees because you get the most logs out of it. But what is a good forest management plan? You take baby trees, middle trees, you know, like the 3 bears?
from my background, I think you have to look at each tree individually. There are trees that are healthy. If they need to continue to grow, we'll leave them regardless of size, diameter, or height. If you have a forest that has sick and diseased trees in them, regardless of their size, their diameter, they need to come out. So I was always an advocate of managing all ages, all sizes of trees on a selective basis and not just having one prescription.
You can understand what's at risk here. Just take your own circumstance with your own home and your own front and backyards. Leave the water turned on. You've heard me talk about this. Mm-hmm. and leave and come back in 15, 20 years and see if you can get in the front door, providing it doesn't burn down first, as such. So it continues to grow. We've got to be able to take each one of those situations and make sure that we add value to it at the same time, the protections that are necessary. So the means are there. They're not that hard to do. This stuff was invented 200 and 300 years ago.
One thing I'd like to add is the focus has been more on forest restoration in the last 10 or 15 years and harvesting and cutting trees of all diameter classes. The forest products industry, at least on the West Coast, is very resilient and very adaptive. And so now we're back into a program of more thinnings of the smaller timber to cover all of the acres. And we have sawmills in place that can handle that type of wood. And we've gone away from strictly harvesting the larger, older trees and not focusing on all of the forest. So I think industry is converted, and I think we're really doing a good job there.
Why is timber, the product of active forestry, such a valuable building commodity?
Well, for several reasons. First of all, it's a renewable resource. It's always growing. If you look at building with concrete and steel, we're taking it out of the earth, it's not replenished. Trees grow back. We're going to have them forever. Secondly, you can put trees into a variety of forms. You can put it into lumber, you can put it into plywood, you can put it into cross-laminated timbers and build big panels and big buildings with them. It has diverse usages. So it's by far the best building material. Again, it's renewable and it's going to be around forever.
So people who want to save resources should be promoting active timbering.
Absolutely. And it takes a lot less energy to make a board than it does to make steel or concrete.
Excellent. This will be a good place for us to take a break, and it sets us up for a good conversation when we come back. We're talking about forest management here on the county seat. We'll be right back after this break.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo River. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
149 million years in the making, dinosaurs once roamed this land. Now they're found at the Dinosaur National Monument. Let's take you beyond the bones. We call it Dinosaur Land. You'll find it offers adventures and sights not seen anywhere else in the world. Come to Dinosaur Land, Vernal, Utah. You'll want to stay forever. The dinosaurs did.
It's one more, here we go again. I tell myself I'm not enough, but one more time is not enough. One last kiss and then you were gone, and I'm here wishing you could stay a little longer. Stay a little longer. Wishing you could stay a little longer.
The Utah Farm Bureau began as a collection of farmers supporting each other to raise the food we enjoy. Today, Farm Bureau membership encompasses everyone, whether ranchers, growers, or just everyday folks like you and me. Members enjoy discounts on items like vehicles and ATVs, or insurance that's very affordable. You don't have to be a farmer to join, and dues are small, but together we make a big difference in keeping our food supply local and abundant. Join Utah Farm Bureau.
Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking about forest management. We left off begging this question, so I'm not going to beg anymore. I'm just going to throw it out there. In an annual basis, I'd like to know which takes more trees, catastrophic wildfire or commercial harvest?
I'll take a poke at that one. You know, you can actually take a look at acres treated over time, and you can see where, as catastrophic wildfires have been occurring, it's taken place at the time the harvest levels have been sloping down. So as the harvest acres went down, fire acres went right on up and past that level. So we've lost more than what we were taking.
In your neck of the woods, what does that turn into in numbers, Tom?
Well, nationally, I think if you look at the Boise interagency fire numbers, we burned over 7 million acres of timberland this past year. And I think the Forest Service records showed they mechanically treated somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 acres. So that's mechanically treating. So but they do prescribed fire and pre-commercial thinnings. But by far, wildfire will damage or decimate a lot more acres than what we're trying to do, managing them in a proper manner.
That takes a second to sink in. You burn 7 million acres and you commercially treat 300,000, not 3 million.
Yeah.
300,000.
Yeah.
Holy smokes. No pun intended.
At that rate of travel, we'll soon be out of the forestry business.
What are the effects downstream after a fire? Obviously, it looks different if you're in an unpopulated area like Panguitch Lake and Brine Head than Santa Barbara. But what sorts of things are impacted by a fire?
Well, I just start out by saying a lot of the amenities we have in the forest, we like a green forest. When you have a forest and it's charred, you lose a lot of the amenities people go out there to travel for. You lose a lot of the riparian buffers where you had for fish and other aspects, and then a lot of damage to the soil. When you get a hot fire that takes all the trees out, it really just cooks the soil. It creates a hard layer on top. Water, especially when you have heavy rainfalls following the fire, cannot penetrate the soil, and it just instantly runs off in sheets, and that's why we're seeing so much of the devastation in Southern California right now. And we could have that right here in this neighborhood.
So it's the heat of the fire crusts the soil to make it impenetrable. Right. It's not the loss of plants per se, it's just that water can't get into the terra firma, so it collects further downstream.
Right. It changes a lot of the chemistry of the soil with the heat, and it just creates a real heavy layer that water can't penetrate through often.
In the case of the Brine Head fire, you know, for the acres burned and lost, it ended up with losing the Panguitch watershed. We had to end up funding a municipal water system by drilling wells up there to replace what we were getting in terms of normal runoffs from the Dixie Forest there prior to that fire.
What's that going to cost Garfield County, even though they're your neighbors, to move to wells? I mean, is that millions of dollars?
It is millions of dollars, and they've already had to come to the state for grants to be able to replace that water as such. So it's been significant.
What other downstream downfire problems can arise from?
Well, I think all of us are interested in a green forest, as I mentioned. Yeah. And if we are not managing our forest after the fire and collecting some fees, we don't replant our forest. And so it maintains itself out there in nothing but a brush field. And we don't have a green forest for, decades.
Yellowstone's been about 30 years since the fire, and it's now for the first time starting to look like a forest. Would that have happened quicker if it had been managed? Would it, cut and reseeded?
You wouldn't have had a complete loss like we had, in the lodgepole pine that was burned up there, So it's taken all this time to replace that and to get it into a position to where it can go back to growing forest again.
Good. I'm going to talk about the nature of this industry when we come back. We'll be right back on the County Seat.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. Oh, there ain't nothing like being raised in the basin with a Ute reservation, skiing starvation, that Duchesne County life.
The Layton Hills Mall offers more than just shopping. Bring the whole family and enjoy SeaQuest Interactive Aquarium to feed the fish and exotic birds, hold live reptiles, and even swim with the stingrays. Or pump up the action and visit Dartside, Utah's premier soft foam dart tag arena. And don't forget the Great Room Escape, where you can challenge your friends to solving mysteries inside themed rooms. So come and experience great fun at the Layton Hills Mall and visit playindavis.com for other great activities.
all local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover flavors you've never tasted and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own Discover Local Food.
Welcome back to the Caddy Seat. We're talking about forest management. We kind of, a little conversation happened during the break here that I think is worthy of mentioning, and that is about the question of how long does it take for a tree to grow up to a point where it looks like a forest tree or is commercially harvestable. I don't want to keep it all on the money, but I mean the two are kind of related. What is your answer?
I'll start by saying it depends on where you're growing the tree and how much moisture that area gets. For instance, in some of the drier climates in eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, California, a tree, you might plant it, it might take 80 to 100 years to grow to a size that it can be a commercial product. On the west side of Oregon and Washington and California, where you have some of the larger fir and of course the redwood that gets a lot of moisture, once you go in and harvest an area, you go and replant it, it can make a commercial product in 35 years. So it is all about the site of the area, how much moisture it gets, and how well you manage it once you plant the tree.
Do we clear cut anymore anywhere?
The Forest Service does do some clear cutting. They open up areas as large as I think 20 acres. Commercially, the private land owning companies, timber companies do clear cut. And the reason they clear cut in Washington and Oregon is to allow Douglas fir trees to regrow. They need full sunlight. And so it's economic reason number one, but number two, it's a reason to grow Douglas fir trees.
So you keep going back to something. We're talking about regrowing. We're talking about regrowing. Is there a point when we no longer can have forests?
No.
No. You know, just in spite of us. We're going to end up with forest and forest growth as we go forward, you know. So I think as we look at this question, is burning it in large burns acceptable, or you ask the question about clear cuts? I'd rather have a clear cut more so than I would a fire. I'd rather have the smaller cuts that Tom was talking about so we can manage patches and species as we go forward.
It also sounds that, well, that's true. We hadn't even talked about wildlife. When you go in and selectively cut or even clear cut 20 acres, what direct impact happens to wildlife in that period of time?
Well, a lot of wildlife species, deer and elk species, like the early seral plant stages. They like the shrubs that come in, they like the grass. And so actually it helps the wildlife because it creates more food. The forests, when they're off limits to management, grow very dense. They grow with a lot of trees coming in. It blocks the sunlight. There's no food on the ground. So really the animals have a lot of thermal cover, but they don't have food. So what we're doing with creating openings is creating food.
Habitats for spotted owl, goshawks, you know, and avian species of that sort. They in turn need a prey base, you know, that comes from the squirrels, the rabbits, and all the rest that grow in the understory. So it's a complex system.
So in the process of saving the owl, who is actually being decimated by some other bird, if I recall my history correctly. Barred owl. It turns out that we're hurting them by just making them off limits to forests because they will eventually become too dense to support wildlife for them to feed on.
Well, I think it's like anything. They need a balance of open areas. They need some forage areas. They need some cover areas.
What's a healthy forest look like? And if you had a textbook case of this is a healthy ecosystem, what would it look like?
I think it'd be multiple species to begin with, and not just a single species as such. But you can get those, like we were talking about in lodgepole pine, naturally, and the rest of it. But I think the healthy forest has to have different heights and different numbers of trees per acre, and a mixture of species between hardwoods and conifers as a mixture.
It's a good answer. I agree. I think if you limit yourself to a forest of one species and you get an insect or disease outbreak, you really run the risk of having that totally wiped out by, for instance, in ponderosa pine, if you have the western pine beetle come in, and it can take out a whole stand. So if you have a variety of age classes, a variety of species, and again, going back to managing that forest on a tree-by-tree basis, I think that's really where we need to get to in forestry and not have a cookbook approach.
Okay, very good. Well, we've run out of time in the segment again. We'll be back with our final segment here on the County Seat.
There is a place where looking out means looking in, where an impression lasting only a few seconds will be imprinted on a life forever, where courage is forged and innocence rediscovered, where remembering is rewarding and forgetting unforgettable. There is a place where truth is felt and where seeing is believing. There is a place.
ATV? Check. Four-wheel driving? Check. Bouldering? Check. Mountain biking? Check. Hiking? Check. River rafting? Check. Adventure is about more than just crossing activities off of a list, but hey, if you can find a place that gives you everything you're looking for, all the better. In Emery County, you'll find the San Rafael swell, trails, lakes, and the small-town hospitality you're looking for. San Rafael Country, in the heart of Utah. Visit us and check something off your list.
In a place that is beyond words, there is nothing to be said, except take your time in Bryce Canyon Country.
Welcome back to the County Seat, our conversation about forest management. We talked about what a good forest looks like. Now let's talk about what good forest management looks like from your expert opinion with 30-year careers in the industry.
Well, I think we have to recognize and realize that we have human communities that are right next door or are directly involved inside of forests as such, so that they're together, you know, and they're dependent, mutually dependent, and we just can't do one without the other. So and we ought to be able to figure out how they interrelate and work together and what's best for the forest.
I think the key is, going back to your statement, what is forest management? It's management, and we have not had management on our forest lands, much of them, for the last 30 years. If you look across the West, we've had the Northwest Forest Plan, we've had the East Side Screens, which limited the size of trees you could harvest. We had the Sierra Nevada Framework in California. We had a lot of funding cut back in Region 4 in the Utah area. We haven't managed our forests, and we've had 30 years of ingrowth and 30 years of collective fuel on the ground and growing to fuel our fires.
There would be a whole bunch of Forest Service employees that say we are managing the forest. I'm at my desk every day doing NEPA analysis. So what would your answer be to that?
Well, again, we talked earlier about how much it's costing just to do the planning, and these folks are doing the planning, but 70% of the dollars that go into a forestry project goes into just planning. 30% of it goes to implementation on the ground. So we have people involved at their desk doing the planning, but we have very, very small percentage of the dollars actually going to the ground to get the work done.
Do you want to venture a guess as to how much was going into that planning process when you guys both started in this business?
I'll bet it's less than 20%.
Yeah. I think early on in the 70s and 80s, when Jim and I started, you could do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement with 20 pages. Oftentimes now, an environmental impact statement might be 600 pages, 700 pages. Takes a year, 2 years to do, $500,000 to $1 million. And it's the planning to make sure that they have everything right, because if they face litigation, and as you know we have litigation, they want to make sure they have everything, their I's dotted and T's crossed to win in court, and it really puts them in a difficult situation.
So what kind of impact has the roadless initiative had on forest management?
That was just another attempt, I think, to extend the wilderness philosophy as to keeping humans off the landscape and access out of the forest.
Well, Jim and I can remember we had Rare 1 and Rare 2. These were the roadless area reviews, and both of those took additional land and set them aside. In the Clinton roadless rule, you can do some management if it's for safety, if it's for bug outbreaks, but very little and very few forests have done any management in roadless areas. So basically, it's almost like a wilderness. It's a hands-off, and it's acres set aside that will continue to grow, continue to add fuel, and at some point in time will burn up, Chad, is how I view it.
Or do we face that with our precious wilderness areas, that they are, because we are completely hands-off, that they may eventually become?
Absolutely. And then the watersheds are gone, the whole works, you know, so it really serves little in the way of utility and purpose, I think, even for the forest and the wildlife that exist out there.
If you look closely at where some of the large fires are occurring, many of them start in the wilderness areas where you can't use mechanized equipment. They'll get a wind to blow the fire out of the wilderness and blow it onto the general forested area. By then, it has such a head of steam up and so much heat that it just balloons into thousands more acres. So part of the problem is we are not addressing our fires in the wilderness. We're burning a lot of our wilderness, and that's creating problems on the general forested area.
Do you think a district forest manager would be a better decision maker on how to handle this forest than policy from Washington?
Well, I think it all starts at the ground level, and I think a good forest supervisor knows his forest. I think he knows what the forest needs, and certainly we need some kind of improvement in legislation form from Washington, D.C. to give him the tools, but the real decision maker needs to be the forest supervisor.
Can you briefly explain to me what a stewardship agreement is?
A stewardship agreement is unlike a timber sale where you just sell a timber sale for a certain amount of money. A stewardship agreement is where you have work to do in the project, you sell it, and the contractor has to perform all of this work, and then dollars come back to the forest as retained receipts. And the retained receipts go to getting the improvements done, like in riparian areas, pre-commercial thinning, and this type of thing. So it's totally different than a timber sale.
Excellent. Gentlemen, we're out of time. We're actually over time. Thank you for watching The County Seat. We will continue this conversation on our website and on our Facebook page. There's the information. We'll see you next week on The County Seat.